Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Waymakers, the podcast that talks about women who are forging their own way in this world. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Waymakers. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about something that I get asked about a lot and is something that would be really helpful to a lot of people. So I thought I'd get this out of the way early. And it's going to be about preparing for an interview. I often get asked different questions about interviewing, from interview prep, how to actually carry yourself in an interview, what questions to ask, and also how to broach certain topics. And as someone who's been on both sides of an interview table many a time, I've seen some catastrophic mistakes, some really interesting mistakes, and really interesting approaches. So I'm going to share some tips, tricks? No tricks, just some tips and advice to prepare for an interview and actually, how to be in the interview. This isn't going to be comprehensive by any means, and it really depends on the actual type of industry you're in and the type of role you're going for, and also even seniority. But just some basic helpful information that I think will start you on your journey as you prepare. I hate interviewing for jobs and going on a job hunt and interviewing. It's exhausting. It requires a lot of effort, and if you're working full time and you're also trying to find a job, it can be quite difficult. And I've been fortunate in that I've worked there's been certain jobs that I've been in where I've actually been able to be quite open and honest about the fact that I am interviewing for jobs, and they've been helpful in terms of giving me time to actually go to them, so I'm not having to lie about doctor's appointments. Or try and do job interviews first thing in the morning or after work when you've had a really long day and you're probably not at your best. But the one thing I would start off with is, well, congrats if you actually have an interview. That is huge, and that is actually a huge element of actually even getting a job, is getting your CV seen by whether it's a recruiter or a HR person and actually getting your foot in the door. That should give you an element of confidence. And let's be real, a lot of times with interviews, a huge element is based on confidence. The fact that you've even got the interview is a big deal, and you should allow that to boost you as you prepare for the interview and feel confident in the fact that you deserve to be there. In my experience, the interview is kind of 40% skill and 60% personality and buzzword cultural fit. At the end of the day, when I'm interviewing someone, I want to know, is this going to be someone that I'm going to get along with, I'm going to enjoy working alongside and be okay and comfortable with spending the majority of my time with? If you're working in an office with someone, you're going to be with them at least 8 hours out of the day. So am I actually going to have fun with them, and are they going to be able to do the job and work in a professional manner, but also be comfortable? So before I get into actually how you should be in the interview, in terms of actual prep for the interview itself, something that I hate is when someone's come in, and I find this obviously with more junior roles. I think when you don't really know what you're meant to do, what you have to do, I find that a lot of times there's a lot of just memorizing the About Us page of a website of the company that they're interviewing for. So really just avoid that. Obviously get familiar with what they do as a business, pick the recruiter's brains to be able to provide information that might not necessarily be in the public space or has been information directly provided by the person that is actually looking for or recruiting for this role. And one thing that I find really helpful to do, or I think is really good to do, is actually using LinkedIn as a research tool. So if I know who's going to interview me, or I'm able to identify key members of staff, but key people within the business whether that will be, if I'm, for example, a finance role, director of finance, head of finance, CFO, management accountants, and kind of getting a feel for the different experiences they have. If you know who you're interviewing with, definitely look through their profile to get a feel for where they studied and how long their career's been, and use that as a way not just to be familiar with them and understand what their background might be, but also as a way to identify questions that you can then ask them during the interview. Ask them about their own career and whether or not they would be able to, say how they found this role and how they even got into that space. Not only does that provide a really good rapport, but it shows that you've thought slightly outside of the box in terms of your research, and coming in and just reciting off, saying, oh, you were started in this year and you do this and you have this many locations, or, because a lot of people do it, it gets really boring, and it doesn't show any kind of creativity or lateral thinking. And that's really what you're looking for when you're interviewing someone. You're like, okay, is this person really going to bring something fresh and new to this role and to the team or to the business? The other thing I would say, and I think this is more so for people if you're interviewing or looking at finance roles or accounting roles, is looking at Companies House, seeing if the accounts are available, and familiarising yourself with how things are going, if they've been making a profit, what the trajectory has been year on year, if they're a relatively established organisation. But also looking at the notes, you can get an understanding of things they've invested in, or decisions or strategic decisions that have been made. That if it's a big enough company, that might be available. Bigger corporations or blue chip corporations tend to have company statements. They will release reports every quarter or every year alongside their results, and those are a great way to get a feel for actually how the company's doing, how they think they're doing, and what their future plans are, for you to be able to discuss that with them, but also say, I think it's great that you're doing X, Y, and Z, and I'm really excited to be part of that journey. So again, it shows that you actually truly care about the business and you're actually truly interested in it. You should want to work for a business. You should want to work in that industry, and it should be of interest to you. That's can be a bit of a luxury. Sometimes you just need to get a foot in the door, and I completely understand that and agree with that. But in terms of your own work-life balance and enjoyment and career progression, it's really important that you actually, you want to see this company succeed. You want to also be part of the journey, and it will allow you to support them and also be part of that, providing your skill set and knowing that you truly want to see them win, and that your career success is dependent on that. Another thing is to look at news articles or company announcements. Again, it's to get a feel for what the kind of fingers in pies that they've got, where they're leading as a business, where they've had any big appointments, so that you can then discuss that or understand, what impact will that have on the business, and is that actually potentially going to affect whether or not you actually see yourself there long term. Be super familiar with the job spec. Very familiar with the job spec. Make sure that you're able to answer those questions that relate to the job spec, and that you actually truly understand the expectations and what's required of you. It's so easy to just see a little bit of a headline and go along with it, but really it's really important that you understand what they want from you, and also for you to be able to understand if you're going to be able to do that job. I'm not saying that should stop you from, taking on the role or wanting to be part of it, but you should also be very comfortable and familiar with what the expectations are. So you can answer questions that they'll have if they require clarity on your experience, if there might be gaps or places where you might not necessarily have experience that can be placed directly in line with their expectations, but you should at least then be able to say where you can adapt, where you can change, where your own skill set will, fill in the gaps, as it were. And as I said, the interview is 40% skill, 60% personality. If you've got an interview, your CV has already told them that you can do this job. You have the right skills and experience to potentially be able to do it. In the interview, what they'll do is they will ask you questions regarding gaps in your CV, you being familiar with the job spec, and understanding your own skill set will take you far in that sense. But then the 60% personality then comes into actually what you should do in the interview. Like I said, the fact that you've got the interview in the first place is huge. And so you should be comfortable and allow that to help boost your confidence that you deserve to be there, and you should be able to answer questions that they have, or at least prepare ahead of time to be able to answer any questions they might have or preempt questions they might have. And again, you should really lean on a recruiter for this, make them earn their keep. Unfortunately, something to be aware of is the fact that the recruiter is not being paid by you. They're being ultimately paid by the business who are looking to fulfill a role. So they will likely put their interests ahead of yours, and sometimes it is a numbers game where they're just trying to get the most amount of CVs in front of a client and to show that they can produce loads of quality candidates for them to choose from. And sometimes they might push you in a direction that you're not comfortable with. So you need to be really clear on actually what kind of jobs you want to do. If it's super early on, I say you can be less discerning, I would say, so that you can get experience, so that you can get used to hearing yourself speak and being more succinct in what you're saying, to be able to kind of condense what it is you want to say, so that it's easier for people to hear you, so you're not rambling, and also for you to get familiar with questions that you might be asked. And after a while, you interview enough, you kind of have a bit of a script in your head, and that really helps because it means that you can just answer confidently, clearly, and understand what it is that you are interviewing for. A key thing to remember, that the interview is also for you as well. It's for you to be able to get a feel for the company that you potentially will be working for, what the culture is, what the vibe is. And if you enjoy working with the people that you're interviewing with, you should also be using that opportunity to be able to identify that and know that for yourself if that's somewhere that you want to be. Another tip for during the interview is actually to try and get them talking too. This kind of bleeds into the section that usually is when they'll turn to you and say, "So, do you have any questions for us?" And this is really important in terms of you being able to showcase to them that you're not just sitting there receiving questions, that you're actually thinking about it and have been quite thoughtful in how you've prepared for the interview, and in terms of the questions that you'll ask. So this would be just a few examples of questions that I think are quite good, or can at least begin a conversation or discussion or get them talking, to kind of prolong the interview. One of them being to ask the person that's interviewing your people why they enjoy working there, what makes X company such a great place to work for, and what the culture's like. Another question that I think is really important is to actually ask them what their short-term expectations are of the role. I would sometimes phrase this as, what is it that you are expecting to be completed within the first 6 months of me being in this role if I were to accept? That could be in the form of objectives or projects. That will give you a good idea of just how intense the role might be to begin with. It'd be important to find out if this role was a completely new role or a replacing of someone who is already in the role. Usually you'll get this information from the recruiter, but sometimes it's worthwhile confirming with the people that you're interviewing with, and also to get an idea of what the structure's like, how many layers are there, is there potentially room for career progression, and what would that actually look like if someone were in that role, and what would be required of that person to prove that they're capable of being there in the long term, but also growing within that entity. A lot of times it's quite easy just to accept a role because it looks good without actually looking for what the future prospects are. I think culturally, obviously, this isn't the working generation of our parents where you get a job for life and you're there 30, 40, 50 years. you have to jump around in order to actually get the best salary, get the best job, get the best opportunity. And while that's a shame, because that means that a lot of knowledge gets lost when people leave roles, and it's a lot of effort and time wasted when businesses can be quite short term in their thinking. I've worked for businesses that have truly just taken the piss with not really encouraging development of people within teams, and also not looking to ensure that they were paid fairly as per market rates. And you'll get people that have come in new, doing a similar job or a similar level, and get paid more because they are new, and no one's really taken it upon themselves to actually turn around and make sure that everyone else aligns with that. And then some people don't feel comfortable asking. Some people do and ask and get told no. And it can be a false economy for a business to say, okay, well, if they've left, they've left. And I personally, if someone left because they wanted more money, I would say go. If that's like your main motivation, there's nothing else keeping you there, because the danger with that is you'll then pay them more and they will go anyway. But I think a sign of a good manager, director, someone who is head of a team or department, is to make sure that people are fairly compensated so that you can retain knowledge, you can save money on recruitment fees if you don't have in-house recruitment or HR, and keep good morale. You want people to be happy, you want people to stay there, and that can be a difficult balance. And ultimately some people do just have to leave, but it's really important if you're interviewing for a job and when you're scoping out a job for you to understand where the room is for you to grow, because sometimes it's a trade-off where you'll take, I wouldn't say necessarily a lower salary, but that your salary might not necessarily grow, but your experience will, and that will look great on your CV and will look great when you're able to interview for jobs and acquire experience and skills that you can then apply for other jobs or apply to other roles, which is important at the end of the day. If there's this new culture that we have to adapt to where you do have to change jobs in order to have the best opportunity, then you need to make sure that you can get the most out of a job. And a lot of times, or sometimes, that is aside from money or benefits. Let me refer to my notes. Questions to avoid. I personally think it's in poor taste to ask questions regarding salary or benefits. There potentially would be some exceptions to this, but that would be dependent on the role. It depends on how you're actually interacting with this business, if you're working through a recruiter or you're working through an internal HR. And what I would say is leave that conversation or any kind of negotiation potentially with the recruiter. Now, it's not to say it's to ask the recruiter and hope that they do that, because they don't always, and sometimes an extra grand is not a big deal for them because their commission is not a huge amount on top of that, and it's probably not worth them annoying the client, but it could be a big deal for you. So what I would say is to actually really highlight why you think you deserve a higher salary. If, for example, you think it's too low for what they're expecting of the role, you might not realise this until you've gone for an interview, and that's fine. So you should then be able to go back to a recruiter and say, I really like them, but they're expecting the role to also do this, this and this, or it's not as clear in the job spec, and therefore you'd be willing to do it, but you would have to be compensated X amount. That shouldn't be a difficult conversation. You've basically done the hard work for the recruiter to be able to actually go back and give them reasons to go back to the client, and the client should be able to take that on board. And what I would say is, if you've identified something before the interview or you're invited back for a second interview, I would definitely try and lay the groundwork for that negotiation or conversation to happen. So if you have identified expectations, or they've discussed responsibilities that aren't super clear in the job spec, or actually would be over and above the title would suggest, then definitely get clarity, bring it up, mention it to the person that you're interviewing with, saying, I've noticed this, is this the expectation? And so at least that's fresh on their mind, and you can then go back to the recruiter and say, I really like them, but I would need this much more. And definitely don't ask about benefits. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but I've had people who've said, yeah, I really want to take this role because you offer private healthcare, or I really like that you do this. And there's only some things that I think are worth mentioning. So a lot of businesses nowadays offer days off in the year to volunteer, etc. And I think that's a great initiative. And actually, you mentioning that in an interview would be really great, to say that I love that you guys have this opportunity, and, you know, I'm really passionate about these different things, and these are my philanthropic pursuits that I could then support using this time off. And you can talk about how it's a great reflection of the actual business, and therefore is a driver. But I mean, I feel like it should go without saying, but unfortunately it sounds really twisted. But sometimes I feel like you kind of have to give them the illusion that this isn't about money, when, let's face it, it's about money. At the end of the day, most of us do not have the luxury of not having to work or needing to work to pay our bills, to survive. And I think unfortunately we have to kind of play along with the idea that you're actually truly here because, you know, you want to be here. And here's hoping that you are there because you want to be there and you enjoy what you do. But it is about money. But we just have to pretend it isn't. After the interview, a lot of recruiters are really good at getting feedback. And if you have applied directly and you're dealing with an internal HR, then do make sure that you follow up and say, if they tell you aren't successful, be like, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. You know, I really enjoyed my experience and I'm really passionate about the business. So I would love to be considered for any future roles that you have. So please do keep me in mind or keep my CV on record. And I would appreciate any feedback. Most people are really, really willing to do that, and sometimes, or a lot of times, do it without you having to ask for it, which would be really good for you to then go forward, apply that. If you do get invited for a second interview, congratulations again. And I think you can then go into the second interview knowing, okay, well, they're happy that I can do the role. And the second interview will either usually be with someone more senior who might have a deciding voice in the matter, and also someone that, although they might not work directly with you, there's someone that will have to interact with you and you will have to do tasks for them. So it's really important that they feel like you are on the ball, that you're professional, that you can be dependable, and that they will actually also enjoy your company. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to showcase personality. Try not to be too stiff. Obviously, don't do a 10-minute stand-up set, but add some humour, smile, direct eye contact, not intense eye contact, but make sure when you're answering questions, you're looking them in the face, not darting around. Unfortunately, I once had an experience of interviewing someone for a role and thinking they were really, really good. And it was quite funny because at the end of the interview, I was kind of asking, not at the end, but as like part of the interview, I was like, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do? Or what have you been doing since, it was like a graduate role. So it's like, what have you been doing since you graduated? You've got like a bit of a gap. And they were like, this is like probably 2019, and they said no, 2020, and they were like, oh yeah, I went traveling. I was like, oh, where did you travel? And they were like, oh, I went to Portugal and Ghana, and I had to laugh because they obviously didn't think that I would know, but I was like, oh, so you've been on like the Afro Nation tour then, have you? And he kind of looked at me, I was like, well, okay, because he clearly was like, oh, I've been travelling, and I was like, no, you've been partying up, and that's fine, you just have to say I've. So I think sometimes be honest. I once ended up interviewing someone that I actually went to university with, and so the dates didn't line up as to when they graduated, because I definitely remember seeing them in some classes, which made me a little bit weary of the fact that they might be lying about a master's that they had on their CV. So don't do that. Don't lie about that. I'm just saying categorically, do not lie on your CV. Yes, people can get away with it, and unfortunately, things fall through the cracks. But you don't want to be the one person that gets caught out, because it's really embarrassing. And, especially if you're working with a recruiter, they're not likely to refer you for any other roles. And I think because they must have recognised me, I think were a bit nervous, because they ended up then telling me, and the person that was with me doing the interview, that they had actually gone out the night before and hadn't had much sleep and had come straight to the interview. And it was a strange thing to say in an interview, and I feel like they were obviously a bit nervous. They weren't expecting to see someone they know, and I think potentially they were nervous because they knew that I knew that their CV was BS, or the timeline was suspicious. But yeah, that's another one. And actually, the person who said they'd gone travelling when really they were partying, which, is one and the same, I guess. Can't really fault him for that. I thought it was funny. It was fine. I invited him back for a second interview with our CEO. It was a really small company, but the CEO was my line manager, so we normally do, that was quite common for them to then do what they would call a grandfather interview with the person above their potential line manager. It was a telephone interview at the time because the CEO was travelling, and she called me afterwards and was like, yeah, no, which was really surprising because she was so adamant about it being a no. And I was like, how bad could it have been? And she was like, he had basically clearly forgotten and was asleep, and she'd woken him up by calling him, because she was like, he was not with it. Like, yeah, it was really strange. And so, which is a real shame, but clearly meant to be, because the person that we ended up hiring was just phenomenal. So everything happens for a reason, I guess. But, set 2 alarms. Make sure you're there on time. Obviously, with the increase in the use of things like Teams and Zoom, there are more likely to be remote interviews, which are great. But you still have to treat them the same way. You still should make sure you dress professionally, that you try and find a nice quiet area for you to do the interview in, so that there's no mishaps or you not being able to be heard properly. And it'll be a shame if Wi-Fi is the reason you didn't get a job that you are super qualified or experienced enough for or capable of doing. So in conclusion, confidence is key, and really truly remember that if you've been called in for an interview, that is huge, and so that should be enough to help boost your confidence, and know that you deserve to be there. This is a terrible thing to say, but actually a phrase that I often use is fake it till you make it, and sometimes, especially in a scenario like this, it does require you faking it till you get through to another interview. But by that point, you should have a better feel for if this is A, a job you want to do, B, a job you think you're capable of doing, and C, a job where you see long-term prospects or benefits that will help you further on in your career. If you'd like more tailored advice or have specific concerns, feel free to email me or get in touch for a business coaching session where we can go through your career goals and go through the job spec that you have and work through that together to understand the questions that might be asked of you, and do some practice. So on that note, I wish you all the best, and a final reminder to set 2 alarms.